With a roundup of all the latest political stories now on ITV1, it's Representing Border.
Good evening. On tonight's Representing Border.
Pro-independence campaigners stage protests here at Holyrood and across the country after a historic ruling from the UK's highest court.
The Scottish Parliament does not have the power to legislate for a referendum on Scottish independence.
The First Minister calls the judgment a hard pill to swallow, accusing Westminster of blocking the democratic right of Scots to choose their own future.
This ruling confirms that the notion of the UK as a voluntary partnership of nations, if it ever was a reality, is no longer a reality.
We respect the clear and definitive ruling of the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom.
I'll get reaction from the Scottish Conservatives' Constitution spokesperson Donald Cameron and from the Scottish Government Minister Neil Gray. And later our commentators Joyce McMillan and Alex Massey are here to consider what the judgment means for the debate on the country's constitutional future.
In the end, it was clear, concise and unequivocal. A unanimous ruling from 5 Supreme Court justices concluding another referendum on independence cannot be held without Westminster's agreement. The judgment was welcomed by pro-union parties and the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, calling on Nicola Sturgeon to work with him on fixing major challenges like the cost of living and the pressures on the NHS. But within hours of losing the court case, the First Minister told a news conference she now had no choice but to turn to her plan B, making the next general election a vote on Scotland leaving the Union.
Disappointed but defiant. Outside the Scottish Parliament, hours after the court's ruling, activists answered the First Minister's call to step up their campaign.
Let us make sure that we take this message to every part of Scotland.
Earlier, their hope that Holyrood would get the green light to hold a referendum were dashed at the Supreme Court.
The Scottish Parliament does not have the power to legislate for a referendum on Scottish independence.
That means Nicola Sturgeon can't hold her planned poll on the 19th of October next year.
That is a hard pill for any supporter of independence and surely indeed for any supporter of democracy to swallow. So this ruling confirms that the notion of the UK as a voluntary partnership of nations, if it ever was a reality, is no longer a reality.
Instead, she launched a campaign to fight the next UK general election on the single issue of independence.
This is no longer just about whether or not Scotland becomes independent, vital though that decision is. It is now more fundamental. It is now about whether or not we even have the basic democratic right to choose our own future. Indeed, from today, the independence movement is as much about democracy as it is about independence.
Her party's partners in government, the Greens, confirmed votes for them would count towards the pro-independence result at the next election. At Westminster, Rishi Sunak welcomed the court's decision.
Will they at least be honest and confirm that the very idea that the United Kingdom is a voluntary union of nations is now dead and buried?
We respect the clear and definitive ruling of the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom. And I think that the people of Scotland want us to be working on fixing the major challenges that we collectively face, whether that's the economy, supporting the NHS, or indeed supporting Ukraine. Now is the time for politicians to work together, and that's what this government will do.
It's not fair, is it?
It's totally unfair.
In Dumfries, these activists said the ruling wouldn't crumple the campaign.
My view is that it's going to strengthen Scottish independence movement.
It's up to Nicola to galvanise the independence movement, and it's up to everyone who cares about Scotland to want to say, even if you're against it.
And this evening they joined fellow campaigners in the town centre to spread that message. But earlier, in an area which voted against independence in 2014, Christmas shoppers gave their own verdicts on the court's decision.
Correct. Shouldn't get independence.
I'm disgusted. I don't think that we should be held to ransom. I feel that we should be able to make our own decisions.
I did vote to break away, but since it's come back round, I think we should stay now.
I'm quite disappointed that Scotland aren't allowed to hold another referendum.
The First Minister has said she'll bring SNP members together for a special conference next year to decide how best to fight their cause at the next general election, making clear that while the legal battle may be lost, the political campaign carries on.
Well, at our news conference, I asked the First Minister about that plan to use the next general election as a de facto referendum.
If you won a legal referendum, then Scotland would have the right to become independent. There's no such thing when it comes to a de facto referendum. You accepted yourself that the voters might decide, you can't dictate what's in a de facto referendum, the voters might decide that independence is a lower priority than, say, the cost of living crisis. So how do you answer that?
Well, how I answer that, Peter, is if I was standing here saying, yeah, I'm not interested in a referendum, that's not my preferred option, I want to take it to an election, that's my preference, and your argument would be, it would have some force. You're not making an argument, you're putting a question to me, but that argument would have some force. But that's not the position we are in. I want to have a referendum. I want to have a referendum that is lawful, democratic and constitutional. That is the best way of asking and having answered the question, does Scotland want to be independent? I'm not resiling from that, but that is being blocked. The Supreme Court has said I don't have the power, the Scottish Government doesn't have the power within the current devolution settlement to do that without the consent of Westminster, and at this stage Westminster won't give its consent. So in that scenario, I have a choice. I either say game's a bogey on Scottish democracy and we'll just give up on Scottish democracy, and frankly, if I ever wake up in the morning thinking that's the right answer, that is the time I will and rightly decide to exit the stage, because nobody in a position like mine should ever give up on democracy. So if I'm not prepared to do that, and I am not prepared to do that, then the only alternative is to say, how do we test this question? We will ask people to vote for the SNP to show their support for independence, and people will make up their mind.
And shortly after that news conference, I got reaction from the Scottish Conservatives' constitution spokesperson.
Donald Cameron, we just start from first principles here. The SNP still want a referendum on independence. They say they have a mandate for a referendum on independence. Is it your position just to simply say no?
Well, our position is, first of all, to welcome the ruling that the Supreme Court have made. It was a clear, unequivocal and unanimous verdict from the court that says that the Constitution is a reserved matter to the United Kingdom, and that the Scottish Parliament cannot legislate for another independence referendum without the agreement of the UK Parliament.
So what is the democratic principle then? What is your answer to the SNP saying they have a mandate?
Well, I'm a unionist politician and I can't be expected to advise the nationalists on how to break up our country. But the point I'd make is that barely 8 years ago, we had a referendum.
You say the UK government say no. Is that the answer?
No, the answer is 8 years ago we had a referendum. Scotland exercised its democratic choice and voted to stay in the Union. And in 2011, there was a consensus. There was a wide consensus across Scotland, not just here in the Scottish Parliament, but also across civic society, that a referendum should happen in the wake of the 2011 election. And both of Scotland's governments, the UK government and the Scottish government, agreed to a referendum. That consensus simply doesn't exist today.
But if Rishi Sunak said in the summer when he was standing in the hustings, we live in a union which is there by consent and by democracy, and I accept that. So do you accept that Scotland is part of the UK as part of a voluntary union?
Yes, it is. It is part of a voluntary union. And 8 years ago, Scotland voted to remain part of that union and secure its place in that union and secure its place in the United Kingdom. And of course, we all know the benefits of that union. The fact that the UK is worth over £2,000 per person in what we call the union dividend. All the many benefits of being part of the union are clear.
But at the last Scottish election, two parties, the SNP and the Green Party, both said that they would come to, if they were elected, they would come to this Parliament and they had a mandate for independence. They have a majority, just as your party has a majority in Westminster. So what then is the route for those people, for those parties, when they say they have a mandate?
Well, as I've said, in 2011 there was a consensus. There was a consensus across Scotland for that a referendum should happen. There was a consensus here in the Scottish Parliament. Every party voted for it, and there was a consensus in wider society. And crucially, there was an agreement between the UK government and the Scottish government that a referendum should happen. Sadly, that consensus does not exist today.
Nicola Sturgeon's talked today about what she calls a de facto referendum, the next UK general election. So if her party, the SNP, get 50% of the vote, will they, in that case, have a mandate which the UK government will have to accept as a mandate for a referendum?
Well, we will treat that election as we treat every election. We will fight that election on the issues that matter to the people of Scotland, on the health service, on the education service and system. We have our first teachers' strike happening tomorrow in Scotland. That's what matters to people. That's when I talk to people on the doors. That's what they're interested in. And it's up to the people of Scotland to decide what that election will be about.
Well, it is. And if the SNP stand on that, if they say this is a de facto referendum, if they get 50% of the votes, will they then have a mandate for a referendum which the UK government will have to agree to?
A general election is a general election that is fought on issues that matter to people in Scotland, and it will be fought on the health service, on the education system, on ferries, on the drug death crisis. And if that's what people wish it to be about, that's what it should be about.
But what if they don't? What if the people back the SNP?
Well, we will fight that election as a general election and fight it all the way through. We are the stout defenders of the Union, but we will focus on the issues that matter to people in their everyday lives.
Do you think the UK government, do you speak to Rishi Sunak or to Alistair Jack, the Secretary of State for Scotland, do you think the UK government is taking the wrong approach to Scotland? What should they be doing now?
No, I think the UK government is taking the right approach. The UK government wants to work with the Scottish government in the interests of the people of Scotland. That's why I'm delighted to see Rishi Sunak, our Prime Minister, adopting a constructive and consensual tone. People want to see Scotland's two governments working together, and that's what Nicola Sturgeon should be doing, not obsessing about referendums. She should be obsessing about the issues that matter to people in their everyday lives.
Donald Cameron, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
For more on the Scottish Government's reaction to the Supreme Court ruling, I turned to the Europe Minister, Neil Gray.
The opposition claim the Lord Advocate knew she had a weak case, so why was time and money wasted in making a losing argument?
No, this was a legal constitutional question that has not been answered, that people wanted an answer to. The opposition parties today said it was the right thing for this to be referred to the Supreme Court for an answer. We respect the outcome and the decision, but now there's a fundamental question here for the UK government, for unionist politicians here in Scotland to answer, which is about democracy. It's about respecting the outcome of elections, and it's about the previously thought of voluntary union that the UK is supposed to be, now not being the case.
Well, there is a fundamental question, and the fundamental question is, what does the First Minister mean by saying that she will make the next UK election a de facto referendum, because she has accepted there won't be an independence referendum?
So, first of all, we're going to go through a process as the SNP through the party around what the next general election, the next electoral event, and how that can allow people to have their democratic say. Because
so you don't
it's clear,
know at the moment?
Because it's clear. Well, we'll set it out. As the First Minister said in the press conference this morning, we will set out the process by which that can come about. But this isn't our preferred route, and we've made that
but it's what's going to happen, though, isn't it? But it is what's going to happen.
But this is the fundamental point,
I know you don't like what the
Peter.
UK government have done.
No, we don't.
But it's what's going to happen, isn't it?
And also, I don't think the people of Scotland will like what the UK government are currently saying, which is that your votes in the Scottish Parliament election last year and the votes at 8 consecutive elections since 2014 don't matter, don't count, have no relevance to you deciding on your own constitutional future. And that is what is currently at stake, is democracy. And the Yes movement now becomes the democracy movement here in Scotland.
Well, let's talk about it then. So can you tell me, will what the First Minister calls a de facto referendum, which previously the Deputy First Minister said would be 50% of the votes, will that give you a mandate for another referendum? Or will it give you a mandate to negotiate independence?
Well, obviously, we're going to set out our perspectives.
So you don't
know? We're going to set that out. I mean, the Supreme Court literally decided
and the
on the legal
de
point.
facto referendum several months ago.
Literally decided upon the legal constitutional issue this morning, we still hold out hope that the UK government might see sense and might respect democracy, as the First Minister set out this morning, and come back round the negotiating table around a Section 30 order or the permanent transfer of power that would allow the Scottish Parliament to hold a referendum, to allow the people of Scotland to democratically express their view on their future. If we have to go to that Plan B, which is going through another electoral route, then we will set out that process, and people in Scotland will be very clear as to the position that we'll be putting to them at that next election.
Just picking up on this democracy thing, the UK government haven't said an absolute no. They've said that the way to do this is for your party to win an absolute majority in the Scottish Parliament, as you did the last time, then they would talk. That's democracy, they say.
There is a majority in the Scottish Parliament, a record majority in the Scottish Parliament that supports holding a referendum and supports independence.
That's amongst MSPs.
And the same was true when the last time that we held a referendum, and the UK government respected the outcome of the 2011 election, which similarly returned a majority that was supported independence. So if it's good enough in 2011, if it's good enough in 2016, where it was only a majority of seats in the UK Parliament that saw the Brexit referendum come to pass, then it's good enough for the people of Scotland now, and they should be respecting the outcome of last year's election and now coming forward and negotiating to ensure that people in Scotland can have their say.
Neil Gray, thank you very much for your time. Let's get some more analysis now on the Supreme Court ruling. Earlier I was joined by our regular commentators, the Scotsman's Joyce McMillan and Alex Massey from The Times.
I began with Joyce. Pro-union parties may be celebrating today's judgment, but which side of the debate might benefit in the long run?
It's always difficult to say who is going to gain from any particular movement in the Scottish independence debate, because it always depends on the conduct of the British government. If the British government continues to be extremely intransigent, to treat the existing devolution settlement with the disrespect that has been shown at times over the last 6 years, to be particularly intransigent on relations with Europe and all of the rest of it, then probably in the medium to long term the SNP will gain from it, because they'll be able to say at every turn what they've been saying this morning: this is no longer a voluntary union and we lack a legal way to depart from it. If, on the other hand, something happens at UK government level, either a much more accommodating sort of John Major-style UK Tory government, or a Labour government with some kind of genuine commitment to a new and different constitutional agenda and to better relations with Europe, then they could be the gainers in the long term, because it gives some clarity about the fact that the SNP can't hold a referendum, and they can then say, look, OK, that's clear, but this is what we're going to offer you.
Okay. Alex Massey, do you agree with that? And how do you see the way the First Minister framed this debate? She was saying today this isn't just about independence, it's about democracy.
Yes, and so that even if you don't support independence, you should support democracy, which means you should support a referendum, which in turn means you should support independence. It's a sort of Jesuitical argument that the First Minister deploys, but it makes no sense whatsoever. This notion that there will be a backlash against this clarification of the law, which is a clarification which demonstrates that the plain meaning of words is actually their meaning, rests upon the proposition that people who do not want a referendum right now will decide they do want a referendum, because Lord Reid has correctly ruled that the Scottish Parliament lacks the unilateral right to legislate for a referendum. Now, that, of course, could happen, but I don't think it's likely to happen in the short to medium term. And remember, it's important to note that for all the First Minister talks about the denial of democracy, as she puts it in characteristically hyperbolic terms, this judgment does no such thing. The route to a referendum is precisely the same as it was in 2011. There can be a referendum, but it has to be an agreed referendum. It can't just be legislated for on a unilateral basis by the Scottish Parliament. And a majority for independence within the Scottish Parliament is a necessary condition for an independence referendum, but not a sufficient one.
Okay. The First Minister talked at our press conference about her first preference being that referendum, but she then moved on to her second preference, if it's just her second, which is what she calls a de facto referendum, the next UK general election. She says that makes sense. Others say you can't determine what is or isn't the issue in a general election.
Well, I thought it was quite interesting that the First Minister actually deferred, all of the detailed questions about how that would work, saying that there would be some kind of special SNP conference next year to try and determine policy on it. So, in a way, she's throwing it back to the SNP in the first instance, and possibly to the wider Yes movement. Do you want to do this, or do you want to just accept this ruling? If we don't just accept it and do try to use a general election, how should we do that? What should the question be? How should we handle it? She's obviously trying. She's kind of outlined the overall strategy that she thinks she'd like to see, but she's kind of throwing the tactics and the detail back to the movement at the moment. And I think that's quite revealing, because it's obviously a very difficult thing to do. But I think Alex, you see, has just this minute demonstrated exactly the kind of triumphalism that is not in the long term going to help the unionist cause here. Because if people just go around saying, oh well, the law always says that, and Nicola Sturgeon's Jesuitical to talk about democracy and all of the rest of it, that is not going to help. Because almost half of the Scottish people have routinely voted for Nicola Sturgeon and her party for almost the past decade, and just ignoring them isn't going to work.
And that is exactly the debate encapsulated. How would you respond?
Well, because I'm not here to pursue or promote any particular agenda, but just to say how I think things actually are, not as I would like them to be, which is how I, perhaps differentiates me from some of the nationalist movement who think that you can have a referendum every 5 years until such time as you achieve the result you desire, at which point there'll be no further referendums. Because, all the arguments for another referendum next year are perfectly strong, but they would be much stronger if there hadn't already been a referendum on precisely this question. And it's the fact that there has been a referendum just 8 years ago that makes this difficult for the First Minister and the nationalist movement, because at present, and of course this may change, there is no overwhelming desire evident amongst the Scottish people to put the question a second time. If that changes, if you get to a situation where 2/3 of Scottish people say that make it clear that they want a referendum, I think it would be almost impossible to avoid having one. But we are not at that moment, and it is not clear to me that a de facto referendum, which is a nonsense legally and constitutionally, will materially alter those circumstances either.
Very briefly then, do you think there will be another independence referendum, and when?
I don't think there will be another independence referendum anytime soon, but I think we're now in a very strange situation where we've been told we're not a colony, therefore there is absolutely nothing that Scotland can do to assert its nationhood against the sovereignty of Westminster. That can't stand indefinitely.
And the same question to you, Alex Massey.
I think there might well be one, but not necessarily this decade.
Alex Massey, Joseph Miller, thank you very much indeed. That's almost all from Representing Border for tonight, and indeed for this week. With changes to the schedule because of the World Cup, we're not here tomorrow night.
But Look Around will keep you up to date with all the day's developments, including reaction to tomorrow's strike by Scotland's biggest teaching union, the EIS. We'll be back on Tuesday, but in the meantime, do get in touch with us if you've any thoughts on anything in tonight's programme.
I hope you can join us again next Tuesday after the late news. But for now, thanks for watching and good night.